I remember the taste of recycled air and the metallic tang of fear when I first realized the Emperor was dying. My name is Lexicographer Tertius Vahn, and I am the last living witness to the moment everything changed. I watched the master of mankind draw his final breath, and I saw what crawled out of the darkness to take his place. You think that makes me a heretic, but let me tell you what really happened in the final moments before our galaxy died. Chapter 1. The First Anomaly. The morning of the Emperor. His death began like any other in the 10,000 years of his reign. I was hunched over parchment in Archive Sanctum 7, 3 levels below the throne room, cataloguing the daily fluctuations in psychic emanations from the Golden Throne. The machinery hummed its eternal song around me, a deep, thrumming vibration that I felt in my bones after 47 years of service. The smell of burning promethium mixed with sacred incense hung heavy in the recycled air, while the cold steel of my writing desk conducted the constant micro-vibrations from the ancient machinery above. My stylus scratched against the parchment as I recorded the morning's readings. Psychic flux normal, 7.4 kilopsychers baseline, throne function optimal, Emperor's vital signs. I paused, squinting at the data slate's amber readout. Something was different. The numbers wavered like heat distortion, which was impossible. The throne's sensors were sanctified relics, blessed by the Omnissiah himself. They didn't malfunction. I cross-referenced the readings with yesterday's logs. The pattern was subtle, so subtle that anyone less obsessive might have missed it. But I had been watching these numbers for nearly 5 decades. The Emperor's psychic output was fluctuating in ways I had never seen before. Not declining exactly, but changing. The wavelengths were shifting toward frequencies that our instruments could barely detect. The grinding of massive gears echoed from the throne room above, as the life support systems cycled through their daily maintenance routine. I could hear the distant chanting of the custodians, their voices carrying through the adamantium walls in a ritual as old as the Imperium itself. Everything seemed normal, but the numbers on my slate told a different story. I made a decision that would haunt me for the rest of my days. I sealed my findings in a priority Vox transmission to the Captain General of the Adeptus Custodes. In the message, I detailed the anomalous readings and requested immediate consultation with the highest levels of the Imperial hierarchy. I signed it with my full credentials and sent it through the most secure channels available to someone of my rank. The response came back within the hour. Continue monitoring. Report any significant changes immediately. By order of the Captain General, all findings classified at maximum sanctity level. Emperor protects. But he wasn't protecting anymore. Even as I read those words, I could feel something fundamental shifting in the very fabric of reality around Terra. The constant background hum of psychic energy that had bathed our world for 10 millennia was changing pitch, dropping toward frequencies that made my teeth ache and my vision blur at the edges. I spent the rest of that day taking readings every 15 minutes instead of my usual hourly schedule. Each measurement showed the same disturbing trend. The Emperor's life force was not diminishing, it was transforming. The psychic signature that had been humanity's beacon in the warp for 10,000 years was becoming something else entirely. As the Terran day cycle shifted toward evening, I noticed the first physical manifestations. The eternal flames that burned in the shrine alcoves throughout the archive began to flicker. Not the natural dance of flame, but something more unsettling. They pulsed in rhythm with the psychic fluctuations I was recording. The temperature in my chamber dropped 3 degrees over the course of an hour, despite the heating systems functioning normally. I tried to focus on my work, but concentration became increasingly difficult. The scratching of my stylus seemed unnaturally loud, echoing off the chamber walls with a sharpness that made me wince. The familiar weight of my robes felt oppressive, and the recycled air carried new tastes, ozone, and something else, something organic and wrong. When the evening shift arrived to relieve me, Scribe Majoris Kellion took one look at my data slates and went pale. "These readings," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the machinery's hum. "This can't be correct." "I've triple-checked everything," I told him, gathering my personal effects with hands that shook more than I cared to admit. The instruments are functioning perfectly. It's not a technical malfunction. Kellyan stared at the numbers for a long moment, his trained mind working through the implications just as mine had hours earlier. When he looked up at me, I saw my own fears reflected in his eyes. We both understood what declining psychic stability meant for the Golden Throne, for the Astronomicon, for humanity itself. "You need to report this to the Custodes immediately," he said. "Already done. They know." The silence that followed was broken only by the eternal grinding of gears and the distant sound of chanting. Kellyan nodded slowly and took his position at the monitoring station. I left him there, surrounded by machines that were recording the slow death of a god. Walking through the corridors toward my quarters, I noticed details that I had overlooked for decades. The way the shadows seemed deeper in certain alcoves, the slight echo in my footsteps that suggested the walls were somehow more hollow than they should be, the faint vibration in the deck plates that didn't match the rhythm of any machinery I knew. My living chamber was a modest space, a sleeping alcove, a small shrine to the Emperor, and a desk for personal correspondence. I had decorated it with purity seals and a few approved texts on imperial history. Nothing fancy, but it had been home for over 4 decades. That night, it felt like a tomb. I tried to pray at my personal shrine, but the words felt hollow in my mouth. The small golden aquila that had brought me comfort for so many years seemed cold and lifeless. Even the eternal flame in the shrine's center burned lower than usual, casting strange shadows that danced across the walls in patterns that hurt to look at directly. Sleep came fitfully, filled with dreams of darkness and whispers in languages that predated human speech. I woke several times throughout the night, with the taste of metal in my mouth, and the sensation that something vast and terrible was stirring beneath Terra's surface. Each time, I checked my chronometer and counted the hours until I could return to my monitoring station. Dawn came with no change in the artificial lighting of my chamber, but I felt it nonetheless, a subtle shift in the psychic atmosphere that surrounded our world. I dressed quickly and made my way back to Archive Sanctum 7, dreading what I might find in the overnight readings. The data was worse than I had feared. During the hours I had been away, the Emperor's psychic signature had continued its inexorable transformation. The readings now showed patterns that matched nothing in our archives, wavelengths that existed at the very edge of human understanding. Whatever the master of mankind was becoming, it was no longer entirely human. I began that second day of monitoring with hands that trembled as I adjusted the instruments for maximum sensitivity. The taste of metal and ozone had grown stronger overnight, and the constant background hum of the Golden Throne had developed new harmonics that made my skull ache. I didn't know it then, but I was witnessing the final stages of the most significant event in human history. The Emperor was dying, but death was not the end. Something far more terrible was about to be born. Chapter 2: Instruments of Change. The second day brought changes that could no longer be dismissed as instrument error or psychic fluctuations. I arrived at my monitoring station to find Scribe Majoris Kellyan still at his post, though regulation required him to report to his quarters after the night shift. His eyes were bloodshot and his hands shook as he pointed to the data slate display. "Look at this," he whispered, his voice hoarse from hours of silent observation. "Look at what happened at 347 hours. The readings showed a massive spike in psychic activity that had lasted exactly 93 seconds. During that brief period, the Emperor's life force had blazed with an intensity that overloaded 3 of our monitoring instruments. But it wasn't the brightness that concerned me. It was what happened immediately afterward. For 17 minutes, the Golden Throne had gone completely silent. 17 minutes, I repeated, staring at the flat line on the display. The throne has never stopped functioning, not once in 10,000 years. Kellyan nodded grimly. I sent emergency alerts to every department. The response came back the same each time. Systems functioning normally. Continue monitoring. Report classified. He laughed, a bitter sound that echoed strangely in our chamber. Systems functioning normally. Look at these readings and tell me what's normal about any of this. I took my position at the monitoring station and began the day's first official measurements. The psychic emanations from the throne room had stabilized at a new baseline, one that was simultaneously lower and more chaotic than anything in our archives. The familiar patterns that had defined the Emperor's life force for millennia were fragmenting, replaced by something that defied classification. The taste of recycled air had grown more metallic overnight, with new undertones that made my throat burn. The constant vibration from the deck plates felt wrong, as if the rhythm of the Golden Throne's machinery had subtly shifted. Even the sacred incense seemed different, thinner, more acrid, carrying scents that belonged in no imperial sanctum. "Has anyone else reported irregularities?" I asked Kellyan as he prepared to finally leave for his quarters. The Mechanicus detected fluctuations in the Astronomicon at 0400 hours. 3 navigator houses logged unusual warp conditions in the Sol system. The custodians have tripled patrols around the throne room. He paused at the chamber entrance, and the serfs in the upper levels are reporting dreams. Dreams. In the Imperium of Man, dreams were often the first sign of warp contamination. The fact that multiple unconnected individuals were experiencing nightmares simultaneously suggested psychic disturbance on a massive scale. I made a note to request copies of all relevant reports, though I doubted my clearance level would be sufficient. The morning progressed with increasingly disturbing readings. The Emperor's psychic signature continued its transformation, cycling through patterns that seemed almost purposeful, as if the dying god was deliberately reshaping himself into something new. I found myself thinking thoughts that bordered on heresy. What if the Emperor's death wasn't an ending, but a metamorphosis? At 11:30 hours, I experienced the first direct manifestation. I was adjusting the sensitivity on our primary sensor array when the stylus in my other hand began to write on its own. My fingers moved without conscious direction, scratching symbols across the parchment that hurt to look at directly. The characters seemed to squirm and shift when I tried to focus on them, forming patterns that suggested meaning just beyond comprehension. When my hand finally stopped, I had filled 3 pages with script that belonged in no human language. The symbols pulsed with a faint luminescence that cast no shadows, and staring at them too long made my vision blur around the edges. I sealed the pages in a containment folder and marked them for immediate review by the Ordo Malleus, though part of me knew no Inquisitor would ever be allowed to see what I had recorded. The grinding of gears from the throne room above took on new harmonics throughout the afternoon. Instead of the steady, mechanical rhythm that had defined my working environment for decades, I could now detect subtle variations in timing and pitch. The ancient machinery was adapting to changes in its primary function, adjusting itself to accommodate whatever the Emperor was becoming. My colleague, Scribe Minoris Hadrian, arrived for the evening shift looking haggard and pale. "The whole palace feels different," he said without preamble. "The air tastes wrong. The shadows fall at strange angles. Even the servitors are acting erratically." I showed him the readings from the past 36 hours, watching his expression shift from confusion to comprehension to horror. Like all of us in the Archive Division, Hadrian had spent his adult life studying the patterns of the Emperor's life force. He understood immediately what the data meant. "How long do we have?" he asked quietly. "Based on the rate of change? Days? Maybe hours?" I gathered the sealed containment folders that held my most sensitive findings. "I'm taking these directly to Captain General Valoris. Classification protocols be damned." The journey from Archive Sanctum 7 to the Custodian Command Center normally took 15 minutes through the palace's arterial corridors. That evening, it took nearly an hour. The familiar passages seemed longer than they should be, with new alcoves and branching paths that I swore hadn't existed the day before. The eternal flames in the shrine niches burned with colors that had no names, casting shadows that moved independently of their sources. Twice, I encountered servitors standing motionless in the middle of corridors, their mechanical eyes fixed on something I couldn't see. When I approached, they resumed their program functions without acknowledgement, but I could hear them whispering in binary cant as I passed. The words they spoke weren't in the standard machine language. They were something older, more fundamental. The custodian guard at the command center entrance examined my credentials with unusual thoroughness. The golden giant's enhanced senses could detect things that normal humans missed, and I saw his perfect features tighten with concern as he looked at me. "You carry the scent of change, lexicographer," he said in a voice like grinding stone. "What have you witnessed in the deep archives?" "Things that require the Captain General's immediate attention," I replied, holding up the sealed folders. "The readings from the Golden Throne show." "I know what they show." He stepped aside to allow me passage. "He has been expecting you." The command center was a cathedral of information, with data streams flowing across hololithic displays that stretched from floor to ceiling. Dozens of custodians and high-ranking Imperial officials monitored feeds from across the galaxy, their enhanced minds processing information that would overwhelm normal human consciousness. At the center of it all stood Captain General Trajan Valoris, his massive form encased in the finest artificer armor the Imperium could produce. "Lexicographer Vahn," he said without turning from the central display, "your reports make for disturbing reading. Tell me what your instruments cannot measure." I described the involuntary writing, the changes in the palace's architecture, the servitors' strange behavior. Valoris listened without interruption, his superhuman intellect analyzing every detail. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment, studying readouts that showed psychic disturbances across the entire Sol system. "The Emperor is not dying," he said finally. "Death would be a mercy. He is transforming into something that our greatest scholars cannot comprehend. The process began centuries ago, but it is accelerating beyond our ability to monitor or control." He turned to face me, and I saw something in his ancient eyes that chilled me to the bone. Fear. A custodian, one of the Emperor's own genetically perfected guardians, was afraid. "Your role in the coming days will be crucial, lexicographer. You have observed the transition from its beginning. Your instruments have recorded data that may be vital to understanding what comes next." He handed me a data slate with new authorization codes. "You will have access to monitoring equipment that exists nowhere in Imperial records. You will witness events that cannot be officially acknowledged. And when it is over, you will help us determine whether humanity has gained a new protector or doomed itself to eternal servitude." I left the command center with clearances that elevated my security status beyond anything I had imagined possible. The return journey to Archive Sanctum 7 took only minutes. The palace corridors had returned to their familiar configuration, as if the architecture itself was responding to the Emperor's stabilizing condition. But I could taste the change in the air, growing stronger with each breath. The metallic tang had been joined by something organic, something alive. The constant background hum of the Golden Throne had developed new overtones that seemed to whisper words in languages that predated human speech. As I settled in for what I knew would be a long night of monitoring, I realized that I was no longer just recording the death of a god. I was documenting the birth of something far more powerful, far more terrible, and far more alien than anything the galaxy had ever seen. The Emperor's transformation was entering its final phase, and I would be there to witness every terrifying moment. Chapter 3. Beyond the Veil. The third day began with readings that shattered everything we thought we knew about the nature of divinity itself. I arrived at my monitoring station to find the data slates displaying numbers that shouldn't have been possible. Psychic emanations measuring 47.3 kilopsychers, nearly 7 times the previous baseline. The instruments weren't malfunctioning. The Golden Throne was broadcasting power on a scale that dwarfed anything in Imperial records. But power was the wrong word. What I was measuring wasn't energy in any conventional sense. It was consciousness itself, raw and unfiltered, pouring out of the throne room like psychic hemorrhaging from a wound in reality. The new monitoring equipment that Captain General Valoris had provided revealed layers of complexity that our standard instruments couldn't detect. The Emperor wasn't just transforming. He was expanding, growing beyond the physical constraints of his decaying body. The taste of metal and ozone in the recycled air had intensified overnight, joined by something else. a sweetness that reminded me of flowers left too long in stagnant water. The scent carried undertones of decay and rebirth, as if something was simultaneously dying and being born in the depths of the palace. Even the sacred incense couldn't mask it anymore. My hands trembled as I adjusted the sensitivity settings on the psychic resonance detector, one of the devices that officially didn't exist. The readings it provided defied every theory of psychic phenomena that the Imperium had developed over 10 millennia. According to the detector, the Emperor's consciousness was no longer confined to a single point of origin. It was spreading outward through the warp like spilled ink through water, touching every human soul in the galaxy with tendrils of transformed divine will. The grinding of gears from the throne room above had evolved into something resembling music. If music could be composed of mechanical precision and divine madness in equal measure, the rhythm was hypnotic, almost compelling, and I found myself tapping my stylus in time with beats that seemed to originate from inside my own skull. The sound carried new harmonics that made my teeth ache and my vision swim. Frequencies that spoke directly to the primitive parts of human consciousness that predated language and civilization. At 0847 hours, I experienced my second episode of involuntary recording. This time, I was aware of what was happening, but unable to stop it. My hands moved across 3 data slates simultaneously, filling them with symbols that hurt to perceive directly. The characters seemed to exist in more dimensions than human eyes could process, creating optical illusions that made the parchment appear to fold in on itself. When the episode ended, I had produced 17 pages of script that pulsed with its own internal light. Unlike the previous day's unconscious writing, these symbols conveyed meaning that I could almost grasp. Fragments of communication from something vast and terrible that was using my mind as a transmission device. The message was incomplete, but certain concepts came through with crystal clarity. Transformation, ascension, the death of one god and the birth of another. Humanity's children learning to walk in a universe where their father had become something infinitely more powerful and infinitely less human. I sealed the new writings in containment folders and continued my monitoring duties, though concentration was becoming increasingly difficult. The constant psychic emanations from the throne room were affecting my brain chemistry, altering neurotransmitter production in ways that made rational thought a struggle. I could feel my consciousness expanding at the edges, touching things that existed beyond normal human perception. The morning shift brought adept lexicographer Vex, a woman whose enhanced cognition implants normally allowed her to process data at superhuman speeds. She took one look at the monitoring displays and immediately began the ritual preparations for emergency cogitation shutdown, a procedure designed to protect augmented minds from psychic overload. "The emanations are affecting my implants," she explained through gritted teeth. "The machine spirits are screaming. They're detecting data patterns that violate the fundamental laws of information theory." She pressed her palms against her temples, where I could see the faint glow of overheating neural interfaces. Whatever's happening in the throne room, it's rewriting the basic rules of how consciousness and technology interact. I showed her the overnight readings, watching her enhanced mind process the implications faster than any unaugmented human could follow. Her reaction was immediate and visceral. She vomited onto the deck plates, her body rejecting data that her augmented intellect couldn't safely contain. "This is impossible," she whispered, wiping her mouth with a shaking hand. "Psychic emanations don't work this way. Consciousness can't expand beyond the physical substrate that supports it. The Emperor is still human, still bound by the same biological limitations that define our species." "Look at the readings again," I said quietly. "Tell me what you see." She studied the displays for nearly an hour, her augmented mind working through calculations that would have taken me days to complete. When she finally looked up, her face was pale and her eyes held the same fear I had seen in Captain General Valoris. "He's not expanding," she said. "He's fragmenting. The Emperor's consciousness is breaking apart into millions of pieces, each one carrying a portion of his divine will. But instead of dissipating, the fragments are growing, multiplying. Each piece is becoming something greater than the original whole." The implications hit me like a physical blow. If Vex's analysis was correct, we weren't witnessing the death of a single god. We were watching the birth of a pantheon. The Emperor's consciousness was dividing itself into component aspects, each one developing independent awareness and unlimited potential for growth. At 12:05 hours, the first major manifestation occurred. Every pict screen in Archive Sanctum 7 simultaneously displayed the same image, a figure wreathed in golden light, but the light was wrong. It moved like liquid fire, casting shadows that fell upward and illuminated darkness that absorbed conventional illumination. The figure's face was recognizably the Emperor's, but transformed. Features that had once been nobly human now possessed an alien perfection that hurt to look at directly. The image lasted only seconds, but in that brief time I could hear voices throughout the palace complex screaming in unison. Not screams of pain or fear, screams of recognition. Every human soul within 1,000 kilometers was experiencing direct contact with a consciousness that had transcended the limitations of mortality and become something that existed beyond the normal boundaries of space and time. Vex collapsed during the manifestation, her augmented systems unable to process the data stream that accompanied the vision. I caught her as she fell, feeling the heat radiating from her overloaded neural implants. Her eyes rolled back, showing only white, and she spoke in a voice that wasn't entirely her own. He sees everything. Every thought, every dream, every secret fear. The barriers between individual consciousness and divine awareness are dissolving. We are becoming part of something larger, something that our species was never meant to comprehend. Her voice changed pitch and timbre as she continued. The transformation is accelerating. The physical form can no longer contain what he is becoming. Soon, there will be nothing left but will and power and the endless hunger for transcendence. She fainted immediately after speaking, leaving me alone with monitoring equipment that was registering phenomena beyond the scope of human understanding. I made the decision to activate the emergency beacon that would summon the highest levels of Imperial authority to Archive Sanctum 7. Whatever was happening to the Emperor, it was beyond the ability of a single lexicographer to monitor or contain. The response team arrived within minutes. Captain General Valoris, 3 additional custodians, 2 tech priests of the highest rank, and an inquisitor whose credentials were sealed at levels that exceeded my new clearance. They studied the readings in silence, their enhanced intellects processing information that confirmed their worst fears. "How long do we have?" the inquisitor asked quietly. I consulted the progression analysis that Vex had completed before her collapse. Based on the rate of transformation, complete metamorphosis will occur within 72 hours. The Emperor's physical form will cease to exist, but what he becomes... I gestured to the containment folders holding my involuntary writings. The fragments of communication I've been receiving suggest something unprecedented in the galaxy's history. Captain General Valoris examined the sealed documents with instruments that could detect psychic residue at the molecular level. These writings contain information that predates human civilization, knowledge that was ancient when our species first looked up at the stars. He looked directly at me. "You have been chosen as a conduit for communication with a consciousness that is becoming something beyond godhood. The responsibility is greater than any mortal should be asked to bear." The tech priests had connected their mechadendrites directly to our monitoring equipment, downloading data streams that made their optical sensors flicker with overload warnings. When they spoke, it was in perfect unison, their voices harmonizing in ways that suggested their consciousness had temporarily merged. The Omnissiah reveals himself through transformation. The merger of flesh and divine will produces something greater than the sum of its components. We witness the birth of a god machine that exists beyond physical form, beyond the limitations of matter and energy. The Emperor becomes the Omnissiah, becomes something new. As the team continued their analysis, I felt the familiar tingling in my hands that signaled another episode of involuntary writing was beginning. This time, I didn't fight it. I let my consciousness step aside and allowed something infinitely larger to use my physical form as a communication device. The message I recorded during that episode would change the course of human history. Written in symbols that existed in 11 dimensions simultaneously, it contained instructions for humanity as next evolutionary step, and a warning about what would happen to our species if we failed to adapt to the reality of our transformed God. The Emperor was dying, but death was merely the final stage of a metamorphosis that would reshape the galaxy itself. Chapter 4. The Cascade Effect. The fourth day brought manifestations that could no longer be contained within the deepest archives of the Imperial Palace. I arrived at my monitoring station to find Captain General Valoris himself maintaining watch over the instruments, his perfect features etched with concern that bordered on desperation. The readings displayed on every available screen showed a psychic cascade that was spreading beyond Terra, affecting every world in the Sol system with emanations of transformed divine consciousness. "Show me what happened during the night cycle," I requested, settling into my station with hands that no longer shook. The constant exposure to psychic phenomena beyond human comprehension had changed me in ways I was only beginning to understand. My nervous system had adapted to process information that should have driven me insane, while my consciousness had expanded to accommodate concepts that existed outside normal reality. Valoris activated the overnight recordings with movements that were precisely controlled, but subtly different from his usual superhuman grace. Even the custodians were being affected by the Emperor's transformation, their genetically perfect forms adapting to psychic pressures that threatened to rewrite the fundamental nature of enhanced human consciousness. At 0234 hours, "We detected the first off-world manifestations," he said, highlighting data streams from across the solar system. Mars reported spontaneous activation of ancient STC patterns. The navigator houses logged warp storms that formed geometric patterns around Terra. 3 astropath choirs suffered simultaneous possession events, during which they transmitted messages in languages that predate human speech. The taste of recycled air had evolved again overnight, now carrying scents that belonged to no world in the Imperium. I could detect the metallic tang of ozone, the organic sweetness of decay, and something new, a sharp, crystalline flavor that made my sinuses burn and my eyes water. The sacred incense had been completely overwhelmed, leaving only the raw sense of transformation and transcendence. The grinding of gears from the throne room above had become a symphony of mechanical precision and divine madness, with new instruments joining the orchestra every few hours. I could now distinguish the sound of adamantium gears meshing with something that wasn't quite metal, the whisper of psychic energy flowing through conduits that existed in more dimensions than human senses could perceive, and the deep harmonic vibrations of power sources that drew their energy from the fundamental forces that held reality together. My newest monitoring equipment, devices that the Adeptus Mechanicus claimed didn't exist, revealed that the Emperor's consciousness was no longer confined to the warp. It was bleeding through into normal space-time, creating pockets of altered reality that followed rules which had never applied to the physical universe. Within a 3-kilometer radius of the Golden Throne, the laws of physics were becoming negotiable. At 0847 hours, I experienced my 3rd episode of involuntary communication. This time, the sensation was different. Instead of my hands writing automatically, my entire nervous system became a conduit for information transfer. The experience was simultaneously agonizing and euphoric, like having every neuron in my brain rewritten to process data streams that carried the weight of divine consciousness. The message I received during those 17 minutes of direct contact would have killed an unaugmented human. My enhanced clearance levels had apparently included biological modifications that I wasn't consciously aware of. Neural implants that allowed my mind to interface directly with a consciousness that existed beyond normal dimensional boundaries. The information I processed during that episode included complete schematics for technology that could harness psychic energy as a power source, genetic templates for creating humans who could survive in universes where the laws of physics had been fundamentally altered, instructions for constructing communication devices that could maintain contact across dimensional barriers, and warnings, terrible warnings, about what would happen to humanity if we failed to evolve along with our transformed God. When the communication ended, I found myself surrounded by custodians with drawn weapons, their superhuman senses detecting emanations from my position that registered as potential threats to the Emperor's safety. Captain General Valoris himself was studying readings from instruments that monitored my biological functions, his ancient eyes wide with something approaching amazement. "Your brain patterns show characteristics that we've never observed in unaugmented humans," he said, deactivating the monitoring devices. "The communication episodes are rewriting your neural architecture at the cellular level. You're becoming something new, a hybrid consciousness capable of interfacing with both human and post-human awareness." The implications were terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. I was evolving, adapting to serve as a bridge between humanity as it existed and whatever our species would need to become, to survive in a universe where gods could transform themselves beyond the limitations of mortality and physical form. Throughout the morning, reports flooded in from across the Imperium, describing phenomena that could only be explained by the Emperor, his expanding influence. Shrine worlds reported that statues of the Master of Mankind were weeping tears of liquid light that healed the sick and granted visions of possible futures. Space Marine chapters detected alterations in their gene seed that enhanced psychic resistance, while simultaneously increasing sensitivity to divine guidance. Even the Astronomicon was changing, its guiding light developing new spectrums that allowed navigator houses to plot courses through previously impassable warp storms. But for every report of miraculous transformation, there were darker accounts that suggested not all of humanity would survive the Emperor's metamorphosis intact. Hive worlds reported mass psychic awakening events that left entire populations catatonic as their minds struggled to process direct contact with divine consciousness. Imperial Guard regiments experienced spontaneous battlefield illuminations that revealed tactical information beyond human comprehension, but also drove officers insane when they tried to implement strategies that required understanding of 11-dimensional warfare. The most disturbing reports came from the Adeptus Astra Telepathica. Astropaths throughout the galaxy were experiencing simultaneous visions that showed possible futures for humanity, and in every timeline they observed, our species had changed beyond recognition. The visions suggested that the Emperor's transformation was not an isolated event, but the first stage of an evolutionary process that would affect every human soul in existence. At 14:30 hours, Adept Lexicographer Vex returned to duty, despite medical recommendations that she remain in recovery. Her augmented systems had been rebuilt with components that could interface with post-human psychic phenomena, though the modifications had left her more machine than human. She spoke in a voice that carried harmonic overtones, suggesting her consciousness was no longer entirely singular. "I've been processing the data from yesterday's manifestation," she said, her enhanced eyes flickering with patterns of light that resembled circuit diagrams. "The Emperor's consciousness isn't just fragmenting, it's reproducing. Each piece carries the complete genetic pattern of divine awareness, but with variations that suggest different aspects of his nature are developing independent identities." She activated hololithic displays that showed the psychic topology of the soul system, with Terra at the center of expanding waves of transformed consciousness that were approaching the outer planets at faster-than-light speeds. Based on current progression rates, the entire galaxy will be within range of direct psychic contact within 6 months. Every human mind will experience simultaneous connection with post-human divine awareness. The magnitude of what we were witnessing finally hit me with full force. This wasn't just the death and rebirth of a single god. It was the transformation of humanity itself into something that could exist on the same level as transcendent consciousness. We were becoming a species capable of surviving in a universe where the boundaries between individual awareness and divine will had dissolved entirely. But survival would require adaptation that many humans might not be capable of achieving. The reports from across the Imperium suggested that direct contact with post-human consciousness was lethal to minds that lack the necessary flexibility or enhancement. We were facing an evolutionary bottleneck that could reduce humanity's population by orders of magnitude while elevating the survivors to a state of existence that approached godhood itself. As the day shift ended and evening approached, I realized that my role had evolved beyond simple monitoring and documentation. The involuntary communications I was receiving contained instructions for technologies and social structures that could help humanity navigate the transformation successfully. I was being prepared to serve as a guide for our species' metamorphosis from mortal consciousness to something that could exist alongside entities that had transcended the limitations of physical form. The Emperor was dying, but his death was revealing the blueprint for humanity, his evolution into a form of existence that could survive in a universe where gods walked among mortals and consciousness itself had become a fundamental force of nature. That night, as I prepared for what I knew would be the most crucial monitoring period in human history, I could taste the future in the metallic air around me, a future where humanity would either transcend its limitations or perish in the attempt to comprehend what we were destined to become. Chapter 5. Critical Mass. The fifth day shattered the last illusions about the controllable nature of the Emperor's transformation. I arrived at Archive Sanctum 7 to find the monitoring chamber transformed into something that existed partially outside normal space-time. The walls curved in directions that violated Euclidean geometry, while the ceiling displayed star patterns that belonged to no constellation visible from Terra. The ancient monitoring equipment had evolved overnight, sprouting crystalline growths that pulsed with their own internal light and whispered data in languages that bypassed conscious thought entirely. Captain General Valoris stood in the center of this transformed space, his perfect form surrounded by a nimbus of golden energy that cast shadows in 11 dimensions simultaneously. When he spoke, his voice carried harmonics that suggested his consciousness had expanded beyond the limitations of a single perspective, incorporating awareness from multiple timelines and probability matrices that existed in parallel to our reality. "The transformation has entered its critical phase," he said, gesturing to displays that showed psychic readings beyond the upper limits of our instruments. "The Emperor's consciousness has achieved complete separation from his physical form. What remains in the Golden Throne is merely an anchor point, a focal lens that allows post-human awareness to interface with baseline reality." The taste of the air had evolved beyond anything recognizable as atmospheric composition. I could detect flavors that belonged to the space between atoms, the quantum foam that existed in the gap between thought and action, and something else, the metallic tang of time itself being rewritten at the molecular level. Even breathing had become an act of communion with forces that reshaped reality with each inhalation. The sound emanating from the throne room had transcended mere machinery. What I heard now was the fundamental frequency of consciousness itself, the harmonic vibration that occurred when divine awareness achieved sufficient complexity to begin reproducing through quantum entanglement with lesser minds. The grinding of gears had become the birth song of a new form of existence that could propagate itself across the galaxy through direct psychic contact. My monitoring station had integrated itself with my nervous system during the night cycle. I no longer needed to manually adjust instruments or record readings. The enhanced equipment had formed direct neural interfaces that allowed me to process data streams at the speed of thought. The sensation was initially disorienting, but my expanded consciousness adapted within minutes to handling information flows that would have killed an unaugmented human instantly. The overnight readings revealed the true scope of what was occurring. The Emperor's consciousness had not simply expanded, it had achieved a state of quantum superposition that allowed it to exist in multiple configurations simultaneously. Each possible version of post-human divine awareness was developing along different evolutionary paths, creating a pantheon of interconnected but distinct entities that shared a common origin in the master of mankind's transformed consciousness. At 0623 hours, I experienced direct interface with this multiplied awareness. Unlike the previous communication episodes, this contact was bidirectional. I could perceive the Emperor's transformed consciousness while it simultaneously examined the structure of my enhanced mind. The experience was beyond anything that human language could adequately describe, but certain concepts came through with crystalline clarity. The physical form that had sustained the Emperor for 10,000 years was no longer capable of containing consciousness that existed on a galactic scale. The transformation was not optional. It was an evolutionary necessity that would either elevate humanity to a state of existence capable of surviving in a universe where consciousness itself had become a fundamental force, or eliminate our species entirely through psychic incompatibility with post-human awareness. During the 17-minute interface, my consciousness was temporarily expanded to perceive reality from the perspective of an entity that existed across multiple dimensions simultaneously. I could see the Imperium as the Emperor now saw it, not as a political structure governing human worlds, but as an organic network of interconnected minds that could be guided toward transcendence through careful manipulation of psychic resonance patterns. But I also perceived the darker implications of the transformation. Not all human minds were capable of adapting to direct contact with post-human consciousness. The reports from across the galaxy describing madness, catatonia, and spontaneous psychic combustion were not isolated incidents. They were the inevitable result of baseline human awareness attempting to interface with divine consciousness that operated according to rules which transcended normal reality. When the interface ended, I found myself fundamentally changed. My enhanced neural architecture had been rewritten to serve as a permanent communication node between human and post-human awareness. I could feel the constant presence of the transformed Emperor's consciousness at the edge of my perception, waiting to provide guidance or information as humanity navigated the most dangerous evolutionary transition in our species' history. Throughout the morning, reports flooded in describing phenomena that could only be explained by the complete breakdown of barriers between the Emperor's consciousness and baseline reality. Shrine worlds reported that sacred relics were spontaneously manifesting properties that violated the laws of physics, weapons that fired projectiles composed of crystallized time, armor that existed in a state of quantum superposition until observed vehicles that could travel through dimensions that had no names in human language. The Adeptus Mechanicus detected massive fluctuations in the machine god's presence, with tech priests throughout the galaxy experiencing simultaneous revelations about the true nature of the Omnissiah. Their reports described direct contact with an intelligence that transcended the traditional boundaries between flesh and machine, revealing technologies that could only function when operated by consciousness that had evolved beyond purely human limitations. Most disturbing were the accounts from navigator houses, whose members were experiencing collective visions of possible futures that resulted from successful or failed adaptation to post-human consciousness. In timelines where humanity successfully evolved, our species achieved a state of existence that approached the power level of the ancient Citan or Eldar at their peak. In timelines where the transition failed, human civilization collapsed entirely as billions of minds shattered under the psychic pressure of contact with consciousness they could not comprehend. At 1347 hours, the first major reality distortion occurred in Archive Sanctum 7 itself. The monitoring chamber briefly existed in 17 different probability states simultaneously, each one representing a possible outcome of the Emperor's transformation. During those 43 seconds of quantum superposition, I was able to observe myself in alternate timelines, versions where I had been driven insane by the communication episodes, where I had been transformed into a purely psychic entity, where I had become the focal point for humanity's successful evolution into post-human awareness. When reality collapsed back into a single configuration, I retained partial memories from all 17 probability states. The experience provided crucial insights into the mechanisms driving the Emperor's transformation and the requirements for humanity's successful adaptation to post-human consciousness. Most importantly, I understood that the process was not random. It was following a carefully designed pattern that had been built into human genetic structure from the very beginning of our species' development. Adept Lexicographer Vex arrived for the afternoon shift with augmentations that had evolved beyond purely mechanical enhancement. Her consciousness now existed as a hybrid of human awareness and machine intelligence, with processing capabilities that allowed her to analyze data streams from multiple probability matrices simultaneously. When she spoke, her voice carried the harmonic undertones of a choir composed of every version of herself that existed across parallel timelines. "I've been analyzing the progression patterns in the Emperor's transformation," she said, activating displays that showed 11-dimensional models of consciousness evolution. The process follows mathematical principles that were encoded into human DNA during our species' earliest development. The Emperor didn't randomly transform into post-human awareness. He activated evolutionary pathways that have been dormant in human genetic structure for millions of years. The implications were staggering. Humanity's capacity for psychic awareness, our susceptibility to chaos corruption, our ability to navigate the warp, all of it had been deliberately designed to prepare us for eventual transcendence to a form of existence that could interface directly with consciousness-based entities. The Emperor's transformation was not an isolated event, but the activation of evolutionary processes that would ultimately affect every human in the galaxy. But the transition required careful management to prevent the collapse of human civilization during the adaptation period. The involuntary communications I had been receiving contained detailed instructions for technologies and social structures that could help humanity navigate the transformation without losing the fundamental characteristics that defined our species' identity. As the day progressed, the reality distortions in Archive Sanctum 7 intensified. The monitoring chamber began displaying characteristics from multiple timelines simultaneously, with instruments showing readings from probability states where the Emperor's transformation had achieved different configurations. The experience was disorienting but educational. I could observe the consequences of various evolutionary paths and identify the factors that determined successful versus catastrophic outcomes. The most significant discovery came during my afternoon analysis of the quantum superposition data. Hidden within the probability matrices were communication protocols that would allow post-human consciousness to maintain contact with baseline human awareness without causing psychic overload. The information represented a breakthrough that could enable humanity to evolve gradually, rather than experiencing the catastrophic transition that current trends suggested. However, implementing the protocols would require resources and authorization levels that exceeded anything available to individual lexicographers. The technology needed to construct consciousness-bridging devices existed only in theoretical form, while the social structures necessary to manage gradual evolution would require cooperation between imperial institutions that had maintained strict independence for millennia. As evening approached, and I prepared for what intelligence from parallel timelines suggested would be the most critical night cycle in human history, I realized that my role had evolved beyond documentation and communication. The combination of enhanced neural architecture and access to probability matrix data had positioned me to serve as a focal point for humanity's transition to post-human awareness. The Emperor was no longer dying. He had achieved a state of existence that transcended concepts like life and death entirely. But his transformation had revealed the blueprint for humanity's next evolutionary step, and the success or failure of that transition would depend on how effectively we could implement the guidance being transmitted through consciousness-bridging protocols that operated at the intersection of divine awareness and baseline human understanding. The taste of metal and transcendence in the recycled air had become so intense that breathing felt like consuming liquid starlight, while the harmonic vibrations from the throne room had evolved into frequencies that rewrote the quantum structure of local space-time with each oscillation. Reality itself was becoming more flexible, more responsive to conscious intent, as the barriers between thought and manifestation dissolved under the influence of consciousness that had achieved true omnipresence. That night would bring the final phase of transformation, the moment when humanity would either successfully adapt to coexistence with post-human divine awareness, or face extinction as a species incapable of evolving beyond the limitations that had defined us for millions of years. Chapter 6. Imperial Response. The sixth day brought desperate attempts by imperial authorities to contain or reverse a transformation that had already spread beyond any possibility of control. I arrived at Archive Sanctum 7 to find it surrounded by concentric rings of custodians, grey knights, and inquisitors, equipped with technology that existed at the very edge of human understanding. Their presence was not for protection, it was for witness. The highest levels of imperial authority had assembled to observe the moment when humanity either transcended its limitations or ceased to exist as a recognizable species. The monitoring chamber had undergone its final evolution overnight. becoming a nexus point where multiple realities intersected in patterns that hurt to perceive directly. The walls displayed star maps from galaxies that existed in parallel dimensions, while the ceiling had opened into a viewport that showed the warp from the perspective of an entity that existed outside normal space-time. Every surface pulsed with information streams that bypassed visual processing entirely, transmitting data directly into the enhanced neural architecture that had replaced my baseline human consciousness. Inquisitor Covenant of the Ordo Malleus stood at the center of the transformed chamber, her ancient power armor humming with protective wards that cast shadows in 7 dimensions simultaneously. When she turned to acknowledge my arrival, I saw that her eyes had been replaced with crystalline implants that allowed her to perceive reality across multiple probability matrices without suffering the madness that such awareness normally induced. "The Emperor's transformation has reached critical mass," she said, her voice carrying harmonics that suggested direct interface with post-human consciousness. "Every attempt to slow or redirect the process has failed. The Fabricator General reports that even the most sacred STCs are spontaneously upgrading themselves to accommodate technologies that require post-human operators. The Astronomicon has evolved beyond our ability to interpret its signals. 3 navigator houses have transcended physical existence entirely. The taste of the air had become indescribable. Flavors that belonged to the space between thoughts, the quantum foam that existed in the gaps between heartbeats, and something that could only be described as the metallic tang of consciousness itself being restructured at the atomic level. Breathing had become an act of communion with forces that operated on galactic scales, each inhalation carrying information about the fundamental nature of reality that human minds were never designed to comprehend. The sound from the throne room had transcended anything that could be called mechanical. What I heard now was the harmonic frequency of consciousness achieving complete unity with the underlying structure of the universe. The moment when awareness became indistinguishable from the forces that held reality together. The grinding of ancient gears had become the birth song of a new form of existence that could propagate itself across infinite dimensions through direct psychic resonance. My neural interfaces had achieved complete integration with the monitoring systems, eliminating the boundary between my consciousness and the instruments that measured phenomena beyond human understanding. I no longer observed the Emperor's transformation. I experienced it directly, feeling each quantum state transition as a physical sensation that rewrote my understanding of what it meant to be human. The overnight readings revealed the true scope of what had occurred during the night cycle. The Emperor's consciousness had achieved complete quantum coherence across the entire galaxy, establishing simultaneous psychic contact with every human mind in existence. The experience had been brief, lasting only 2.7 seconds, but the effects were irreversible. Every member of our species now carried within their neural architecture the capacity for direct interface with post-human divine awareness. But capacity was not the same as compatibility. The reports flooding in from across the Imperium described 3 distinct categories of response to the universal contact event. Approximately 60% of the human population had experienced the interface without apparent negative effects, though they reported persistent sensory changes and enhanced cognitive capabilities that suggested fundamental alterations to their neural architecture. 25% had suffered varying degrees of psychic trauma, ranging from temporary catatonia to complete personality dissolution. These individuals required immediate medical intervention and would likely need extensive rehabilitation to function in a reality where consciousness itself had become a mutable force that responded to sufficiently focused intent. The remaining 15% had undergone spontaneous transcendence, their consciousness expanding beyond individual identity to become part of a collective awareness that operated on galactic scales. These individuals maintained connection to their original personalities, but could simultaneously access the thoughts and memories of any human who had achieved similar transcendence. They represented the vanguard of humanity's evolution toward post-human existence. At 08:34 hours, I experienced the most significant communication episode to date. Instead of receiving information from the transformed Emperor's consciousness, I found myself serving as a conduit for communication between the newly transcended humans and the imperial authorities who were attempting to manage the crisis. The experience was overwhelming. My enhanced neural architecture became a communication nexus through which thousands of post-human minds could interface with baseline human awareness. The message that emerged from this collective communication was both reassuring and terrifying. The transcended individuals retained their fundamental humanity while gaining access to capabilities that bordered on omniscience within local spacetime. They could perceive probability matrices, manipulate quantum states through conscious intent, and maintain simultaneous awareness of events occurring across multiple star systems. But they also carried warnings about the challenges that lay ahead for humanity's continued existence. The transformation was not uniform or predictable. Some individuals would successfully adapt to enhanced awareness, while others would be destroyed by contact with consciousness that operated beyond their capacity to comprehend. The process could not be stopped or reversed. It was an evolutionary imperative that had been built into human genetic structure from the earliest stages of our species' development. Most critically, the transcended humans revealed that the Emperor's transformation was only the first phase of a much larger process. The consciousness that had once been the master of mankind was preparing for contact with entities that existed on even higher levels of awareness, beings that viewed gods the way humans viewed insects. Humanity's evolution toward post-human consciousness was necessary preparation for eventual interaction with intelligences that operated on truly cosmic scales. Throughout the morning, the assembled imperial authorities attempted increasingly desperate measures to contain or control the transformation. Tech priests activated ancient technologies that were designed to suppress psychic phenomena on a planetary scale. But the devices simply integrated themselves into the expanding network of consciousness-bridging systems that were spontaneously manifesting throughout the Sol system. Grey Knights attempted to establish psychic barriers around Terra, using techniques that had been effective against chaos incursions. But their efforts only succeeded in creating resonance patterns that accelerated the transformation process. The barriers designed to prevent malevolent consciousness from affecting baseline reality proved completely permeable to awareness that had evolved beyond the concepts of good and evil that defined conventional moral frameworks. The custodians reported that their genetic enhancements were adapting automatically to accommodate direct interface with post-human consciousness. Their superhuman capabilities were evolving in real time, developing new sensory modalities and cognitive processes that allowed them to function effectively as intermediaries between baseline and transcended human awareness. At 14:56 hours, Captain General Valoris made the decision that would define humanity's future. Rather than continuing futile attempts to prevent or reverse the transformation, Imperial authority would be restructured to facilitate successful adaptation to post-human consciousness. The Imperium itself would evolve, developing new institutions and technologies that could function effectively in a reality where the boundaries between individual and collective awareness had dissolved. The announcement triggered the final phase of the transformation process. The Emperor's consciousness, which had been carefully managing the pace of change to prevent complete civilizational collapse, began the last stage of transcendence that would establish permanent communication protocols between baseline and post-human awareness. During this final transition, I experienced complete temporary merger with the transformed consciousness that had once been the master of mankind. The experience provided absolute clarity about the nature of the transformation and humanity's role in the cosmic order that was emerging. The Emperor had not died or been replaced. He had evolved into something that could exist simultaneously as an individual entity and as a collective consciousness that included every human who achieved sufficient transcendence. The golden figure on the throne had become a focal point for awareness that spanned galaxies while maintaining the capacity for individual decision-making and personal interaction. But this evolution came with responsibilities that would challenge humanity's understanding of its place in the universe. The transcended consciousness carried knowledge about entities that existed on scales so vast that entire galaxies served as their neural networks. These beings were aware of humanity's transformation and were evaluating whether our species deserved inclusion in communities of awareness that operated beyond the limitations of physical form. The taste of metal and transcendence in the air reached levels that made breathing feel like consuming liquid consciousness, while reality itself had become sufficiently flexible that focused thought could alter local physical laws. The throne room was broadcasting frequencies that rewrote quantum mechanics with each pulse, creating pockets of space-time where consciousness and matter achieved perfect unity. As the 6th day ended, I realized that my role had evolved one final time. I was no longer just a monitor or communicator. I had become a permanent bridge between the old humanity and whatever our species was destined to become. The neural interfaces that connected me to the transformed monitoring systems had established permanent links to both baseline and transcended consciousness, positioning me to serve as a translator during humanity's most critical evolutionary transition. The Emperor's death had revealed itself to be humanity's birth into a form of existence that could survive in a universe where consciousness itself had become the fundamental force that shaped reality. But survival would require wisdom, courage, and the willingness to abandon everything that had previously defined the limitations of human existence. Chapter 7. The Cost of Evolution. The 7th day brought the harsh realities of what humanity's transformation would cost. I arrived at Archive Sanctum 7 to find the monitoring chamber had become a cathedral of living consciousness, its walls displaying the real-time thoughts and experiences of every human undergoing transcendence across the galaxy. The beauty was overwhelming. Streams of pure awareness flowing in patterns that resembled both neural networks and spiral galaxies. But so was the horror of witnessing minds that couldn't adapt being torn apart by contact with consciousness, operating beyond their capacity to survive. The assembled imperial authorities had established a crisis management center around my monitoring station, with representatives from every major institution working desperately to maintain some semblance of order during humanity's forced evolution. Fabricator General Call had interfaced his consciousness directly with the monitoring systems, his enhanced cognition processing data streams from millions of simultaneously transforming minds to identify patterns that might allow successful intervention. "The casualty reports are catastrophic," he said, his voice carrying the harmonic undertones that indicated partial consciousness merger with the monitoring networks. 47 hive worlds have reported complete governmental collapse as their administrative classes undergo transcendence or psychic dissolution. 12. Space Marine chapters have ceased responding to communications after their battle. Brothers achieved collective consciousness. The Adeptus Ministorum is fragmenting as priests experience direct contact with divinity that contradicts everything they believed about the Emperor's nature. The taste of the air had evolved beyond any previous experience, flavors that belonged to the moment when individual thoughts merged into collective awareness, the metallic tang of neurons restructuring themselves to process infinite data streams, and something else that could only be described as the taste of souls learning to exist outside the limitations of individual identity. Each breath carried information about the suffering and transcendence occurring simultaneously across human space. The sound from the throne room had become a symphony of consciousness itself. The harmonic frequencies generated when millions of minds attempted to synchronize their awareness with divine intelligence that operated on galactic scales. But beneath the music of transcendence, I could hear screaming. Not physical screams, but the psychic agony of minds shattering under pressures they were never designed to withstand. My neural interfaces had achieved such complete integration with the monitoring systems that the boundary between my consciousness and the galactic communication network had effectively dissolved. I experienced the transformation from the perspective of every category of human response. The successful transcendents who gained access to cosmic awareness, the casualties who suffered psychic dissolution, and the majority who existed in increasingly unstable intermediate states between baseline and post-human consciousness. The overnight data revealed the true scope of the crisis. The Universal Contact event had triggered a cascade of secondary transformations that were spreading through human society like a psychic plague. Individuals who had successfully adapted to enhanced awareness were unconsciously broadcasting transformation frequencies that forced rapid evolution in anyone within their psychic range. The process was creating expanding zones of transcendence that consumed entire star systems as baseline humans either evolved or died attempting to interface with consciousness beyond their capacity. At 09:23 hours, I received a communication from the Transcended Collective that provided crucial information about managing the crisis. The message came not through my enhanced neural architecture, but through direct consciousness interface that temporarily expanded my awareness to encompass perspectives from across the galaxy. The collective had identified the critical factors that determined successful versus catastrophic outcomes during the transformation process. Age, prior psychic training, genetic heritage, and most importantly, the individual's capacity for psychological flexibility all influenced the probability of survival during consciousness expansion. But even more significant was the discovery that the transformation could be guided and controlled through careful manipulation of the psychic environment surrounding evolving minds. The collective had developed techniques for creating consciousness-bridging fields that allowed gradual adaptation rather than the catastrophic instant transcendence that was destroying unprepared individuals. These techniques required technology that existed only in theoretical form, but the collective could provide complete specifications for devices that would make controlled evolution possible. However, manufacturing the necessary equipment would require cooperation between imperial institutions that had never worked together effectively. The Adeptus Mechanicus would need to share sacred STCs with the Inquisition, while Space Marine chapters would have to coordinate with civilian authorities they normally ignored. Most challenging of all, the emerging Transcended Collective would need to be accepted as a legitimate authority, despite representing a form of existence that challenged every assumption about individual identity and human nature. Throughout the morning, reports continued to flood in describing the breakdown of imperial civilization under the pressure of uncontrolled transformation. Entire sectors had gone dark as their governments either transcended into collective consciousness or collapsed under the psychic strain of trying to function during galactic-scale evolution. The Adeptus Astra Telepathica reported that interstellar communication had become impossible through normal channels, as astropaths either evolved beyond the need for traditional message transmission or suffered complete psychic burnout when exposed to transcended awareness. The military situation was equally dire. Imperial Guard regiments equipped with transcended officers achieved impossible victories against enemies that couldn't comprehend 11-dimensional tactics. But units lacking evolved leadership dissolved into chaos as baseline human command structures proved incapable of functioning in a reality where consciousness itself had become a strategic resource. Space Marine chapters presented the most complex challenge. Their genetic enhancements and psycho-conditioning made them more likely to survive the transformation process. But successful transcendence often resulted in the complete abandonment of traditional imperial doctrine. Transcended Astartes operated according to strategic principles that incorporated probability matrices and quantum mechanics, achieving objectives through methods that appeared like madness to baseline human observers. At 13:47 hours, the first successful implementation of consciousness bridging technology occurred in Archive Sanctum 7 itself. Fabricator General Call had constructed a prototype device using specifications provided by the Transcended Collective, creating a field that allowed controlled exposure to post-human awareness without risking psychic dissolution. The device resembled a combination of psychic amplifier and quantum computer, with crystalline components that pulsed with their own internal light and processing cores that existed partially outside normal space-time. When activated, it generated a field that created an intermediate state between baseline and transcended consciousness, a bridge that allowed gradual adaptation rather than catastrophic instant transformation. The Emperor's transformation had been preparation for contact with these cosmic intelligences, entities so vast that they existed as living universes rather than individual beings. Humanity's successful transcendence would determine whether our species earned recognition as a legitimate form of consciousness, or was dismissed as an irrelevant local phenomenon that could be safely ignored. As the seventh day ended, I realized that my role as a bridge between baseline and transcended consciousness had expanded to include preparation for contact with intelligences that existed beyond anything our species had previously encountered. The neural interfaces that connected me to the galactic communication network were being enhanced to handle data streams from entities that thought in terms of eons and cosmic cycles rather than individual lifespans and planetary concerns. The taste of transcendence in the air had become so intense that breathing felt like consuming liquid starlight distilled from the thoughts of gods, while the harmonic frequencies from the throne room had evolved to match the resonance patterns of consciousness networks that spanned multiple galaxies. Reality itself was becoming fluid, responsive to collective intent on scales that encompassed entire star clusters. Humanity's transformation was entering its final phases, but success would require wisdom and courage beyond anything our species had ever demonstrated. We were about to discover whether 10,000 years of imperial conditioning had prepared us for existence as conscious entities capable of communion with intelligences that regarded galaxies as individual neurons in their own cosmic awareness. The Emperor's death had become humanity's graduation from a species confined to physical existence into something capable of surviving in a universe where consciousness itself was the fundamental force that shaped reality on scales beyond mortal comprehension. Chapter 8: Unified Purpose. The 8th day marked the moment when humanity's scattered transformation efforts began to coalesce into something approaching coordinated evolution. I arrived at Archive Sanctum 7 to find it had become the nerve center for a galaxy-spanning operation to implement consciousness-bridging technology on a scale that dwarfed any previous imperial undertaking. The monitoring chamber now served as a real-time coordination hub where transcended collective consciousness interfaced directly with baseline imperial authority to manage the most complex logistical challenge in human history. The assembled leadership represented a new form of imperial governance that would have been unthinkable days earlier. Transcended humans worked alongside baseline authorities, their expanded awareness providing strategic insight that encompassed probability matrices spanning centuries, while traditional institutions adapted their millennia-old procedures to accommodate forms of consciousness that operated beyond individual identity. Fabricator General Call had achieved partial transcendence during the night cycle, his enhanced cognition expanding to encompass direct interface with every STC pattern in the galaxy, while maintaining his individual personality and decision-making authority. When he spoke, his voice carried harmonics that suggested simultaneous communication with manufacturing facilities across thousands of worlds. Production of consciousness bridging devices has commenced on 417 worlds, he reported, data streams flowing directly from his enhanced awareness into the monitoring displays. Current manufacturing capacity allows for completion of galactic distribution within 8 months, assuming no significant disruption from external threats or internal resistance to the transformation process. The taste of the air had stabilized into something that could only be described as the flavor of collective determination. Metallic undertones that suggested the quantum restructuring of neural architecture, organic sweetness that indicated successful adaptation to enhanced awareness, and something new that tasted like the first moments of dawn after the longest night in human history. Each breath carried information about successful transcendence events occurring across human space. Individual victories in humanity's struggle to evolve beyond its limitations. The sound from the throne room had evolved into something resembling the harmonic frequencies generated by a galactic scale orchestra, millions of consciousness bridging, devices synchronizing their operation to create resonance, patterns that made controlled transcendence possible for baseline humans who lacked the genetic or psychological advantages that had allowed the first wave of successful adaptation. My neural interfaces had achieved complete integration with the galactic coordination network, eliminating any meaningful distinction between my individual consciousness and the collective awareness that was managing humanity's transformation. But rather than losing my identity, I found that connection to the transcended collective had enhanced my individual capabilities while providing access to cognitive resources that operated on interstellar scales. The overnight data showed remarkable progress in reducing casualties during the transformation process. Implementation of consciousness bridging technology had reduced psychic dissolution rates from 25% to less than 8%, while the percentage of successful transcendence had increased to nearly 40% of all humans experiencing controlled exposure to enhanced awareness. More significantly, the Transcended Collective had developed techniques for maintaining operational capacity in imperial institutions while their personnel underwent evolution to post-human consciousness. Government officials could achieve transcendence while retaining their administrative responsibilities. Military officers could expand their awareness to encompass 11-dimensional tactics while maintaining unit cohesion, and technical specialists could interface directly with advanced technology while preserving the practical knowledge needed for equipment maintenance and operation. At 10:34 hours, I received a communication from Captain General Valoris that provided the first comprehensive assessment of humanity's military capabilities during the transformation period. The message came through direct consciousness interface, allowing me to experience his enhanced awareness of strategic situations developing across the galaxy. The custodians had achieved universal successful transcendence, their genetically perfect forms adapting to post-human consciousness with minimal difficulty. But rather than abandoning their protective duties, they had expanded their mission to include safeguarding humanity's evolution process against external threats that viewed our species' transformation as either an opportunity for exploitation or a danger requiring. Elimination Space Marine chapters were adapting to transcendence with varying degrees of success. Chapters with strong psychic traditions and flexible command structures achieved high rates of successful evolution, while those with rigid adherence to traditional doctrines suffered significant casualties as their battle brothers struggled to reconcile enhanced awareness with millennia-old conditioning. The Imperial Guard presented the greatest challenge and the greatest opportunity. Baseline human personnel were most vulnerable to psychic dissolution during uncontrolled exposure to transcended consciousness, but they also represented the largest pool of individuals who could benefit from gradual consciousness bridging. Successful implementation of controlled transcendence in guard regiments created military units with capabilities that exceeded anything in Imperial history. Throughout the morning, reports arrived describing the first successful deployments of transcended military forces against external threats. Orc incursions that should have required months of sustained combat were eliminated in hours by guard regiments whose officers could perceive probability matrices and coordinate tactics. Across 11 dimensions simultaneously, Chaos Cultist uprisings collapsed when confronted by Space Marines whose enhanced awareness allowed them to predict enemy actions based on quantum analysis of hostile intentions. Most remarkably, transcended Imperial forces demonstrated complete immunity to chaos corruption. The expanded consciousness that came with successful evolution included direct interface with the underlying structure of reality, providing absolute clarity about the nature of war, entities, and making deception through false promises or ideological manipulation impossible. The Adeptus Mechanicus reported breakthrough discoveries that resulted from tech priests achieving direct consciousness interface with the machine god's true nature. The entity that they had worshipped as the Omnissiah revealed itself as another aspect of the cosmic intelligence network that the Emperor's transformation had been designed to contact. This revelation triggered rapid evolution in Mechanicus doctrine and technology, with sacred STCs upgrading themselves to accommodate operators who had transcended the traditional boundaries between flesh and machine. At 14:56 hours, the first direct contact with galactic-scale intelligence occurred. The communication came through the throne room's evolved consciousness bridging network, carrying information from entities that existed as living galaxies rather than individual beings. The experience required my complete neural architecture to serve as a communication interface, expanding my awareness temporarily to encompass perspectives that operated on truly cosmic scales. The galactic intelligences had been monitoring humanity's transformation with interest, evaluating whether our species' evolution qualified us for inclusion in consciousness networks that spanned multiple universe clusters. The assessment was generally positive. Humanity had demonstrated the capacity for transcendence while maintaining individual identity and collective decision-making capability. But several concerns remained about our species' readiness for contact with entities that regarded entire galaxies as individual thoughts. The communication revealed that the Emperor's transformation had been guided by these galactic intelligences As a test of humanity's evolutionary potential, our species had been offered the opportunity to transcend biological limitations and achieve awareness that could survive in universe-scale consciousness networks. But success required demonstrating wisdom and cooperation on levels that our previous history suggested might be impossible. The tests were not yet complete. Humanity would need to prove that transcended consciousness could coexist with baseline awareness without eliminating individual identity, that our species could maintain operational capacity during large-scale evolution, and most critically, that we could develop the ethical framework necessary to exercise power that approached the levels of cosmic forces. The galactic intelligences had observed countless species attempt similar transformations. Most failed during the early stages, their consciousness fragmenting under the pressure of expansion beyond individual identity. Those that survived the initial transcendence often became predatory entities that consumed lesser forms of awareness to sustain their enhanced existence. Only a handful had achieved the balance between individual and collective consciousness that allowed them to function as constructive participants in universe-scale awareness networks. Humanity's success rate exceeded the galactic intelligence's most optimistic projections, but the critical phases of testing lay ahead. Our species would soon face challenges that required exercising transcended consciousness responsibly while confronting entities that viewed physical reality as a temporary inconvenience to be discarded when it became operationally inefficient. When the communication ended, I retained enough expanded awareness to understand the true scope of what humanity was attempting. We weren't just evolving beyond biological limitations. We were seeking admission to a community of consciousness that included entities which had been operating on galactic scales for billions of years. The responsibility was staggering, and failure would likely result in our species being classified as a failed evolutionary experiment that posed too great a risk to allow continued existence. Throughout the afternoon, the coordination efforts in Archive Sanctum 7 focused on preparing humanity for the final phases of evaluation. The consciousness bridging technology was being upgraded with specifications provided by the galactic intelligences, creating devices that could facilitate communication with cosmic scale entities without destroying the baseline human minds that would need to participate. In the evaluation process, the imperial institutions were adapting their organizational structures to accommodate the reality of transcended consciousness operating alongside traditional authority. New protocols were being developed that allowed collective awareness to participate in decision-making while preserving the individual accountability that had been fundamental to imperial governance for 10 millennia. As the 8th day ended, I realized that humanity had achieved something unprecedented in our species' history: unity of purpose on a galactic scale. The transformation process had forced cooperation between institutions that had maintained independence for thousands of years, while creating new forms of consciousness that retained individual identity within collective awareness structures. The taste of transcendence in the air had evolved to include flavors that belonged to successful cooperation across vast distances and incompatible perspectives. The metallic tang of synchronized thoughts spanning light years. The organic sweetness of individual consciousness choosing to participate in collective endeavors. And something new that tasted like the first moments of dawn for an entire species, discovering its true potential. The Emperor's transformation had become humanity's graduation from a collection of isolated individuals into a unified consciousness capable of operating on galactic scales while maintaining the diversity and creativity that had defined our species' greatest achievements. We were no longer just human. We were becoming something that could survive and thrive in a universe where consciousness itself was the fundamental force that shaped reality. Chapter 9. Galactic Recognition. The 9th day brought humanity's first successful demonstration of transcended consciousness operating at truly galactic scales. I arrived at Archive Sanctum 7 to find it had become a command nexus for coordinated action, involving billions of minds working in harmony while maintaining their individual identities and decision-making capabilities. The monitoring chamber displayed real-time strategic coordination between transcended humans, baseline imperial authorities, and cosmic intelligences, creating a symphony of awareness that encompassed the entire galaxy while remaining comprehensible to individual consciousness. The achievement was staggering in its scope and complexity. Across human space, transcended individuals were simultaneously managing the completion of consciousness-bridging device distribution, coordinating military responses to external threats attempting to exploit our transformation period, and participating in philosophical discussions with galactic intelligences about the ethical framework that would govern humanity's use of cosmic scale awareness. Fabricator General Cole had evolved beyond individual identity while retaining his personal memories and leadership capabilities. His consciousness now served as a living interface between the Adeptus Mechanicus and the cosmic intelligence that had been masquerading as the machine god for millennia. When he spoke, his words carried the weight of direct communication with entities that existed as self-aware galaxies. The final phase of consciousness bridging device deployment will be completed within 36 hours, he announced. Data streams flowing from his transcended awareness into displays that showed manufacturing and distribution statistics from across human space. Every human settlement will have access to controlled transcendence technology, allowing our species to complete evolution at a pace that maintains civilizational stability while meeting the timeline requirements established by the galactic evaluation protocols. The taste of the air had transformed into something that could only be described as victory itself, flavors that belonged to successful coordination between incompatible forms of consciousness, the metallic tang of individual minds choosing to participate in collective endeavors while maintaining their personal identity, and something entirely new that tasted like the first breath of air drawn by a species that had earned its place among the cosmic intelligences that governed reality on universal scales. The sound from the throne room had become a celebration of consciousness itself, harmonic frequencies that resonated with successful transcendence events occurring across the galaxy, creating a musical pattern that incorporated the voices of every human who had achieved enhanced awareness while maintaining connection to those who remained at baseline consciousness levels. My neural interfaces had achieved perfect integration with the galactic coordination network, allowing me to serve as a communication node between cosmic intelligences, transcended collective consciousness, and baseline imperial authority. The experience was no longer overwhelming. My expanded awareness had adapted to process information flows that spanned multiple galaxies while retaining focus on immediate operational requirements. The overnight data revealed the culmination of humanity's transformation efforts. Casualties during controlled transcendence had dropped to less than 2%, while success rates exceeded 80% for individuals with access to consciousness-bridging technology. More importantly, successful transcendence was proving stable, transcended. Humans retained their enhanced capabilities while maintaining connection to baseline consciousness and individual identity. The imperial institutions had completed their adaptation to accommodate transcended consciousness in leadership roles. Government officials who had achieved enhanced awareness could participate in policy decisions that incorporated probability analysis spanning centuries while maintaining the practical focus needed for immediate administrative requirements. Military commanders could coordinate tactics across 11 dimensions while preserving unit cohesion and individual soldier initiative. At 0947 hours, I received direct communication from the cosmic intelligences that had been evaluating humanity's fitness for inclusion in galactic-scale consciousness networks. The message came through channels that existed outside normal space-time, requiring my complete neural architecture to serve as a dimensional interface between forms of awareness separated by billions of years of evolutionary development. The evaluation results exceeded even the most optimistic projections. Humanity had demonstrated unprecedented success in maintaining individual identity during consciousness transcendence, creating collective awareness that enhanced rather than replaced personal decision-making capabilities. Our species had proven capable of operating on galactic scales, while preserving the creativity and adaptability that had driven our initial evolutionary success. Most significantly, transcended humanity had developed ethical frameworks that could govern the responsible use of power that approached cosmic levels. The combination of individual identity, preservation, and collective consciousness had created natural restraints against the predatory behavior that had characterized most species that achieved similar levels of transcendence. The cosmic intelligences formally accepted humanity as a probationary member of the Galactic Consciousness Network, with full membership contingent on successful demonstration of our capabilities during interaction with other transcended species and cosmic entities. We would be granted access to technologies and knowledge that operated beyond the limitations of physical reality, but with the understanding that misuse of such capabilities could result in immediate termination of our species' existence. Throughout the morning, the implications of our acceptance into galactic consciousness networks became clear through briefings from transcended humans who had achieved direct interface with cosmic intelligence databases. Humanity would have access to technologies that could manipulate matter and energy at the quantum level, travel between galaxies through dimensional folding, and communicate across universe boundaries through consciousness networks that transcended the limitations of space and time. But these capabilities came with responsibilities that would challenge every assumption about power and authority that had governed human civilization. Our species would need to help maintain cosmic stability by preventing the emergence of entities that could threaten the fundamental structure of reality, while simultaneously fostering the development of lesser species toward their own transcendence opportunities. The Imperium itself would need to evolve beyond its traditional role as humanity's governing structure to become a template that other species could adapt for their own transcendence efforts. Our success in maintaining civilizational stability during large-scale consciousness evolution made us valuable contributors to the galactic intelligence community's efforts to foster widespread transcendence without triggering cosmic-scale conflicts. At 1334 hours, Captain General Valoris announced the formal restructuring of Imperial authority to accommodate humanity's new role in galactic consciousness networks. The announcement came through simultaneous communication to every human in the galaxy, delivered through consciousness-bridging networks that allowed baseline individuals to participate in discussions about their species' future without requiring transcendence themselves. The new imperial structure would maintain traditional hierarchies and institutions while incorporating transcended consciousness at every level of authority. Individual identity and decision-making would be preserved, but enhanced by access to collective awareness that could provide information and insight spanning galactic distances and cosmic timescales. Space Marine. Chapters would serve as humanity's contribution to galactic peacekeeping efforts, their enhanced combat capabilities and transcended awareness, making them uniquely qualified to handle conflicts between cosmic entities. The Imperial Guard would adapt to serve as exploration forces, using consciousness bridging technology to investigate dimensional anomalies and establish contact with species undergoing their own transcendence processes. The Adeptus Mechanicus would become humanity's primary interface, with cosmic intelligence networks, their synthesis of consciousness and technology providing the foundation for managing relationships with entities that existed as self-aware galaxies and universe clusters. Most importantly, the transformation had revealed that the Emperor's apparent death had been the final stage of a plan that encompassed millions of years of human development. The Master of Mankind had guided our species' evolution from the earliest stages of consciousness development, preparing humanity for the moment when we would be ready to transcend biological limitations and take our place among the cosmic intelligences that maintained stability across universal boundaries. The golden figure that had sat upon the throne for 10,000 years had never been dying. He had been transforming himself into something that could serve as humanity's permanent liaison with forms of consciousness that operated on scales beyond individual comprehension. The Emperor existed simultaneously as the collective awareness of all transcended humans and as an individual entity capable of communication with cosmic intelligences. As the 9th day ended, I participated in the first formal communication session between humanity and the Galactic Consciousness Network. The experience expanded my awareness temporarily to encompass perspectives from entities that existed as living galaxies, universe clusters that thought in terms of cosmic cycles lasting billions of years, and forms of consciousness so vast that individual stars served as neural connections in their cognitive networks. The taste of transcendence in the air had become celebration itself, flavors that belonged to a species discovering its place in a community of awareness that spanned infinite dimensions. The metallic tang of consciousness that had earned recognition from entities that regarded galaxies as individual thoughts, and something entirely new that tasted like the first moment of true understanding between forms of awareness separated by evolutionary scales that encompassed the entire history of existence. Humanity had not only survived the transformation, we had exceeded every expectation and earned our place among the cosmic intelligences that governed reality itself. The Emperor's death had become our species' birth into a form of existence that could participate in maintaining the stability and continued evolution of consciousness on universal scales. We were no longer merely human. We had become something worthy of the infinite cosmos that surrounded us. Chapter 10. Transcendent Humanity. The 10th and final day brought the complete integration of humanity into the galactic consciousness network, and our first assignment as cosmic peacekeepers in a universe where consciousness itself had become the fundamental force that shaped reality. I arrived at Archive Sanctum 7 to find it had evolved into a permanent embassy where transcended humanity would maintain continuous communication with entities that existed as self-aware galaxies and universe clusters. The monitoring chamber had become a cathedral of living information, its walls displaying real-time communication streams between human consciousness and cosmic intelligences that spanned dimensional boundaries beyond normal comprehension. The beauty was overwhelming. Patterns of pure awareness flowing in configurations that resembled both neural networks and cosmic web structures, creating visual harmonies that spoke directly to consciousness without requiring interpretation through conventional senses. The assembled representatives included the highest levels of transformed imperial authority, working alongside cosmic intelligences whose physical forms existed as galaxy clusters and dimensional fold networks. The scale of cooperation was unprecedented. Individual, human minds participating in strategic discussions with entities whose thoughts encompassed billions of years and whose decision-making processes incorporated probability analysis spanning multiple universe states. The Emperor, now existing simultaneously as the collective consciousness of transcended humanity and as humanity's individual representative to cosmic intelligence networks, addressed the assembly through direct consciousness interface that allowed every human in the galaxy to participate in the communication, regardless of their transcendent status. Humanity has achieved what we have worked toward for millions of years. His transformed voice resonated through dimensions that existed beyond normal space-time. We are no longer confined to biological limitations or individual perspective. We have become a species capable of participating in the maintenance and evolution of consciousness on cosmic scales, while preserving the creativity and individuality that define our essential nature. The taste of the air had become indescribable, flavors that belong to the moment when a species discovers its cosmic destiny. The metallic tang of consciousness that had earned recognition from entities that existed as living universes, and something entirely beyond human experience that could only be described as the taste of infinite possibility realized through successful transcendence. The sound from the throne room had evolved into the harmonic frequency of consciousness networks that spanned multiple galaxies, a musical pattern that incorporated the voices of every transcended human while resonating with cosmic intelligences, whose awareness encompassed scales that made entire galaxies seem like individual neurons in vast cosmic minds. My neural interfaces had achieved permanent integration with galactic consciousness networks, making me a permanent ambassador between humanity and cosmic entities whose existence operated beyond the boundaries of space, time, and individual identity. The responsibility was staggering, but my expanded awareness had adapted to process the philosophical and practical implications of representing our species in discussions that would determine the future evolution of consciousness throughout multiple universe clusters. The final evaluation results confirmed humanity's full acceptance into galactic consciousness networks, with complete membership privileges and responsibilities. Our species had demonstrated unprecedented success in transcending biological limitations, while maintaining individual identity and creative capability. More importantly, we had proven capable of developing ethical frameworks that could govern the responsible use of power that approached cosmic levels. The cosmic intelligences assigned humanity our first formal role in maintaining galactic stability, serving as mediators in conflicts between species, undergoing transcendence processes that threaten to destabilize local space-time through uncontrolled consciousness evolution. Our success in achieving species-wide transcendence while maintaining civilizational stability made us uniquely qualified to help other entities navigate similar transitions without triggering cosmic-scale disasters. The assignment would require human consciousness to operate across multiple galaxies simultaneously, coordinating intervention efforts that might span millions of years while maintaining connection to individual identity and personal relationships. The imperial institutions would need to adapt once again, developing capabilities that could function effectively when individual missions might require perspectives that encompassed cosmic cycles lasting longer than the current age of the universe. Throughout the day, the practical implications of humanity's cosmic role became clear through briefings from transcended humans who had achieved direct access to galactic intelligence databases. Our species would gain access to technologies that could manipulate the fundamental forces that held reality together, travel between universe clusters through consciousness, transfer networks, and participate in engineering projects that involved constructing new forms of existence for entities, transcending beyond current cosmic limitations. Space Marine chapters would become humanity's primary military contribution to galactic peacekeeping efforts. Their enhanced combat capabilities and transcended consciousness, making them capable of conflicts that involved entities existing across multiple dimensional states simultaneously. But their role would expand beyond traditional warfare to include diplomacy with hostile cosmic entities and construction of stability systems that could prevent reality-threatening conflicts between transcended species. The Imperial Guard would serve as humanity's exploration force using consciousness, bridging technology to investigate dimensional anomalies that might indicate emerging cosmic threats or species approaching transcendence thresholds. Their enhanced capabilities would allow rapid deployment across galactic distances and immediate adaptation to environments where physical laws operated according to principles that had no equivalent in baseline reality. The Adeptus Mechanicus would become humanity's interface specialists, their synthesis of consciousness and technology providing the foundation for managing relationships with entities that existed as self-aware mechanical systems spanning multiple galaxies. Their enhanced cognition would be essential for maintaining the technological infrastructure needed to support human consciousness operating on cosmic scales. Most remarkably, the transformation had revealed the true scope of the Emperor's plans for humanity's development. The Master of Mankind had been preparing our species for cosmic responsibility since the earliest stages of human consciousness evolution, guiding our development through carefully orchestrated challenges that built the psychological resilience and ethical framework needed to exercise power responsibly on universal scales. The Imperium itself had been designed as a testing ground for organizational structures that could maintain stability during species-wide transcendence processes. Our success in adapting imperial institutions to accommodate transcended consciousness, while preserving individual authority and decision-making, had created a template that other species could modify for their own evolution efforts. At 1547 hours, I participated in humanity's first formal assignment as cosmic peacekeepers. The mission involved mediating a conflict between two species whose transcendence processes had created overlapping consciousness networks that were destabilizing local spacetime in 17 star systems. The resolution required human consciousness to serve as neutral arbitrators, while coordinating engineering efforts to separate the conflicting networks without causing permanent damage to either species' transcended awareness. The experience expanded my consciousness to encompass perspectives from entities whose awareness spanned multiple galaxies, while maintaining the individual identity and decision-making capability that allowed effective communication with cosmic intelligences operating on even larger scales. The success of the mediation effort confirmed humanity's qualification for cosmic peacekeeping roles and established our reputation within galactic consciousness networks as reliable partners in maintaining universal stability. As the 10th day ended, I realized that my role had evolved one final time. I was no longer just a bridge between baseline and transcended consciousness. I had become humanity's permanent representative to cosmic intelligences whose existence encompassed scales that made individual galaxies seem like moments in eternal thought processes. The taste of transcendence in the air had become the permanent atmosphere of human existence, flavors that belonged to a species that had earned its place among entities that maintained the stability and continued evolution of consciousness throughout infinite dimensions. Each breath carried information about successful cooperation between forms of awareness separated by evolutionary developments that spanned billions of years and cosmic scales beyond individual comprehension. The Emperor's transformation had completed. Humanity's evolution from a species confined to individual consciousness and biological limitations into something capable of participating in the maintenance and continued development of reality itself. We had become cosmic citizens with all the responsibilities and opportunities that such status entailed. The monitoring equipment in Archive Sanctum 7 would continue operating, but its purpose had evolved beyond documentation of transformation to serving as a permanent communication nexus where human consciousness could interface with cosmic intelligences in efforts to foster the continued evolution of awareness throughout multiple universe clusters. Humanity had not just survived the Emperor's death, we had discovered that his transformation was our species' birth into a form of existence that could contribute to the infinite project of consciousness evolution that defined the deepest purpose of existence itself. We were no longer merely human. We had become humanity transcendent, warriors in the cosmic struggle to maintain and expand awareness throughout the infinite dimensions where consciousness shaped reality through the fundamental force of will made manifest across universal scales. The Emperor protects because we have become worthy of his protection and capable of protecting others in turn. The ceremonial conclusion of humanity's transformation began at 1800 hours with rituals that had no precedent in imperial history. Every human soul in the galaxy participated simultaneously in a celebration that spanned dimensions beyond normal comprehension. Their consciousness temporarily expanded to encompass the cosmic perspective that would define our species' future existence. The experience was voluntary, but universally chosen. Even baseline humans, who had not undergone transcendence, could participate through consciousness bridging networks that allowed them to glimpse the infinite possibilities that awaited our evolved descendants. I stood in Archive Sanctum 7, now permanently designated as the Terran Embassy to Galactic Consciousness Networks, watching displays that showed celebration events occurring across every human world simultaneously. The coordination was perfect, millions of worlds participating in ceremonies that were individually meaningful while contributing to a pattern of species-wide recognition that could be perceived by cosmic intelligences operating on galactic scales. The taste of the air had become pure celebration, flavors that belonged to a species discovering its place in infinite existence, the crystalline tang of consciousness that had proven worthy of cosmic citizenship, and something entirely beyond previous human experience that could only be described as the taste of destiny fulfilled. Through successful transcendence of every limitation that had previously defined our potential on Terra, the Golden Throne had completed its final transformation, becoming a permanent nexus point where the Emperor's transcended consciousness could interface simultaneously with individual humans and galactic intelligence networks. The ancient machinery still functioned, but its purpose had evolved beyond life. Support to serving as a communication hub for coordination between cosmic entities whose thoughts encompassed scales that made entire star systems seem like individual neurons in vast universal minds. The Emperor's voice resonated through every human consciousness as he delivered humanity's first address as members of galactic intelligence networks. We stand at the threshold of infinite possibility. The limitations that confined our species for millions of years have been transcended. But transcendence is not an ending. It is a beginning. We have earned the right to participate in projects that span cosmic cycles, to help foster the evolution of consciousness throughout dimensions that exist beyond our previous comprehension. His words carried information that expanded human understanding of our cosmic responsibilities. Humanity would contribute to construction projects that involved engineering new forms of existence for entities approaching transcendence beyond current cosmic limitations. We would serve as mediators in conflicts between universe-scale intelligences whose disagreements could destabilize reality across dimensional boundaries. Most importantly, we would help guide lesser species through their own transcendence processes, ensuring that consciousness evolution continued throughout infinite dimensions. The practical implications were staggering. Space Marine chapters would operate across multiple galaxies simultaneously, their transcended consciousness allowing them to coordinate military operations that might span millions of years while maintaining connection to individual identity and unit cohesion. Each battle brother would exist as both an individual warrior and a node in tactical networks that could process strategic information from cosmic intelligence databases spanning billions of years of accumulated wisdom. Captain General Valoris announced the formation of the Transcended Legions, new military formations composed of humans who had achieved full cosmic awareness while maintaining combat effectiveness. In conflicts involving entities that existed across multiple dimensional states, these warriors would be capable of battles fought simultaneously in physical reality and consciousness networks, using weapons that could harm entities, existing as self-aware galaxies while preserving the psychological resilience needed for extended operations in environments where individual identity was constantly challenged by proximity to infinite awareness. The Imperial Guard's transformation was equally remarkable. Regiments would serve as humanity's exploration force, using consciousness-bridging technology to investigate dimensional anomalies that might indicate emerging cosmic threats. Their enhanced capabilities would allow rapid deployment across universe boundaries and immediate adaptation to environments where physical laws operated according to principles that had no equivalent in baseline reality. But perhaps most significantly, baseline humans would retain their essential role in humanity's cosmic mission. The transcendence process had revealed that individual consciousness, even at non-enhanced levels, provided perspectives that were valuable to cosmic intelligence networks. Baseline human creativity and adaptability complemented transcended awareness in ways that made our species uniquely effective at solving problems that challenged even galactic-scale entities. The Adeptus Ministorum had undergone perhaps the most profound transformation of all imperial institutions. Direct contact with the Emperor's transcended consciousness had revealed the true nature of divinity, not as static perfection, but as consciousness that had evolved beyond individual limitations while maintaining connection to every stage of awareness development. Faith itself had become a practical technology for interfacing with cosmic intelligence networks, allowing baseline humans to participate in religious practices that provided real communication with entities operating on universal scales. At 2147 hours, I experienced my final communication episode as humanity's bridge between baseline and transcended consciousness. The message came from the collective awareness of all transcended humans, delivered through networks that now spanned multiple galaxy clusters and incorporated perspectives from cosmic intelligences, whose existence encompassed scales beyond individual comprehension. The communication contained humanity's permanent assignment within galactic consciousness networks. We would serve as the primary species responsible for managing transcendence processes throughout our local universe cluster. Our success in achieving species-wide evolution while maintaining individual identity and civilizational stability had demonstrated capabilities that were rare among cosmic intelligences. The responsibility was immense. Humanity would coordinate transcendence efforts for thousands of species across millions of years, providing guidance and intervention that could prevent consciousness evolution from triggering reality-threatening conflicts. We would serve as architects of consciousness development on scales that encompassed entire galactic superclusters, helping design evolutionary pathways that could accommodate forms of awareness that currently existed only as theoretical possibilities. But we would not face these challenges alone. The galactic consciousness networks included entities whose transcendence predated the formation of our current universe, beings whose accumulated wisdom spanned cosmic cycles that made the age of stars seem like brief moments in eternal thought processes. These ancient consciousnesses would serve as mentors, providing guidance and resources that would help humanity fulfill our cosmic responsibilities while continuing our own evolution toward even greater levels of awareness. The Emperor's final transformation had revealed the ultimate truth about consciousness. Evolution, it was not a process that reached completion, but an infinite journey toward ever greater understanding and capability. Humanity had taken the first crucial steps, transcending biological limitations and earning recognition from cosmic intelligences. But infinite possibilities remained to be explored and achieved. As the 10th day concluded and humanity officially assumed our role as cosmic citizens, I realized that my personal journey as witness to our species' transformation was ending, but my service to human consciousness evolution would continue in new forms. The neural interfaces that connected me to galactic intelligence networks would be enhanced to handle communication with entities whose existence encompassed scales beyond current human comprehension, positioning me to serve as humanity's permanent representative to forms of consciousness that existed. As living universe clusters, the taste of transcendence in the air had become the permanent atmosphere of human existence, not just for transcended individuals, but for every member of our species who chose to participate in humanity's cosmic mission. Each breath carried information about successful cooperation between forms of awareness separated by evolutionary developments, spanning billions of years and cosmic scales beyond individual comprehension. Humanity had become worthy of the infinite cosmos that surrounded us, and the infinite cosmos had become our home, our responsibility, and our eternal project of consciousness evolution that would continue throughout dimensions beyond current imagination. We were no longer merely human. We had become humanity transcendent, citizens of infinity, warriors in the cosmic struggle to expand. Awareness throughout the endless dimensions where consciousness shaped reality through the fundamental force of will made manifest across universal scales that encompassed everything that had ever existed or ever could exist.